Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to yet another edition of the Liberia History Channel on Focus on Liberia. My name is Dennis Jar, and we are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. In tonight's edition of the History Channel, we're going to be looking at Joseph Jenkins Robert Part 2 in our series, The Presidents of Liberia. As always, presenter is the resident historian, Carl Campbell. Carl, welcome to the
Student of
show.
history. Student of history. How you doing, Dennis? Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My faithful handful of fellow students.
It's good to really talk about history. I like the definition. History is the study of past and present.
That's a good definition.
That's how we know history to be. So we're going to be studying about, our first president. He was president twice, Joseph Jenkins Robert. Last week we delved into his growing up, his life, coming to being born in the United States, coming to Liberia with his what is now today Liberia with his family, and the
Right.
early life there. And we went into a little bit of what were some of the issues at that time. Today we want to go into another. That is part two. The story of Joseph Jenkins Robert is so long that we can even talk about it in a year's time. We're trying to have an abridged version, in Liberia. Anytime they tell you since J.J. Robert time, I mean, this is as old as you can think about. So it is very important that we study about Joseph Jenkins Roberts. We're going to go as far as Edwin Barclay, but let's start with J.J. Roberts, and we'll go. For the other president from Tubman to present, we have enough material out there. So we want to be able to dig up what is not really out there so as to present it in this fashion. We want to welcome all our viewers from across the globe. Of course, this is focused on Liberia, and we are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. Let me give it to a call to just give us a preview of what we're going to be dealing with today. Carl?
So we talked about Joseph Jenkins Roberts and his early childhood, who he was, who his parents were, who his mother was anyway, and his stepfather, Mr. Roberts. We talked about that whole background and how he emigrated to Liberia with his brothers and his mother and his sister and his wife and young baby, who unfortunately did not survive, to reach full maturity. His baby died first, and then later on, his wife. But Roberts continued. His brother went on to be a doctor. His other brother went on to be clergy, and they were very prominent and influential in the Liberian society. His mother was affectionately called Auntie by the people in the community. And Roberts, the human being, is what we discussed last time. So, we talked about Auntie Roberts and her children and how successful they are. Now we're going to focus on Roberts, his political life, his life as governor of the Commonwealth of Liberia, and then later on, the first and then the seventh president of the Republic of Liberia. I can't hear you, Dennis.
Call from last week, we also learned that Joseph Jenkins Robert did not arrive with the first group of the people coming from the United States.
Right.
Right. He was not among the first shipload that came to the shore. Neither was he among those who came through Sherbrooke before coming to.
Right.
So will you consider Joseph Jenkins Robert as one of the founding fathers of Liberia?
Well, we did a whole show on the founding fathers of Liberia.
Right.
And we didn't mention Roberts.
And the question came, is River says Prof said, was Joseph Jenkins Robert a founding father? Joseph Jenkins.
Again, normally when you talk about founding fathers of a republic, you're talking about the people who draft the Constitution, the people who lead the independence struggle. And so in light of what that typically means, the answer is no.
So today we're going to study Joseph Jenkins Roberts. Last week also, when we were doing the show, people were saying, in fact, somebody asked me, he said, what do you know about Joseph Jenkins Roberts? Tell me what you know about Joseph Jenkins Robert growing up. Okay, we know a lot of things out there you might have heard in the street. Today, we want to go into books and see what is written down. That will help. So this is part two, the first and second president of Liberia. This first
The first and
presidency and the
seventh.
second.
First and seventh. I put second. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
This
I
is the
mean,
first.
yeah,
So here,
first, yeah, he was not the second. He was the seventh.
it doesn't
No,
say
no,
second. Let me just
no, you
clarify.
said the second presidency. So
Yes,
I
not
got
the
it
second
correct.
president, the first presidency and the second presidency.
Yeah,
He was the first and seventh president.
right.
Well, today we're going to discuss his first presidency, which was the first president, and we're going to discuss his second presidency, which is when he was the seventh president in succession. So his first and second presidency.
So as we learned, he was born March 15, 1809, and he passed away February 24, 1876. He was the first and seventh president of the Republic of Liberia. We also learned last week that as the seventh president, he died in office. But we're going to go through that today, starting with this one. And I will read, and Carl is going to elaborate.
Yes.
The United States did not recognize Liberia until after the United States Civil War, but had continued to exercise a fostering care through its quadrum as far as they could do so. By international agreement, we had to keep a force of about 80 guns on the coast for the suppression of the slave trade up to the year 1861. It's Joseph Jenkins Roberts.
Yeah. So these are okay. So the United States had an agreement with Great Britain it was in their interest, because since 1819 the transatlantic slave trade was illegal. However, illegal it was in 1819. We know it continued well into the 1880s.
Yeah.
And in fact, the last known slave ship to arrive in the United States arrived in the United States, I think, in 1864. So during the Commonwealth period, they were still fighting to stop this transatlantic trade. I mean, the Dahomey Kingdom and Oyo Kingdom conflict, they were still selling human beings into bondage. So the U.S. Navy, their purpose of being there with these guns was supposedly, and what they manifest to be they're doing, was to squash the transatlantic slave trade. And so Roberts, we're going to go through as we follow this, he becomes almost like this Lord of War. He becomes this man who is violently and aggressively snuffing out something that he absolutely hated, which was the entire process of people being sold into bondage. It was, for him, one of the worst things that could be done to a human being was for them to be, sold into slavery. And these barracoons, which are these slave depots all along the coast within the Liberian, adjacent to the Liberian settlement, adjacent to the Commonwealth of Liberia. It was so extreme, and he was instrumental with the help of the U.S. Navy and also the British Navy. They empowered him in ways to be able to do the things he did and advance the cause of abolition on the west coast of Africa.
So let's go to our second slide. Let's make that bigger. By the terms of the Ashburton Treaty, the United States bound themselves to keep a naval force of 80 guns on the west coast of Africa for the suppression of the slave trade, as you just mentioned. The first squadron sent to the station in 1843 was under the command of Commodore M.C. Perry, the Macedonian.
So let me pause you there. I made that bold because Commodore M.C. Perry was a extremely violent person. extremely violent person. He had really no patience for peaceful negotiation. And Commodore Perry was really the person who kind of
Call your audio is getting a little scratchy there.
okay. Let me let you continue to read, and then I'll come back to the point.
All right.
Our country, sweet Mandela, our country, that God gave us this country. Tell Liberia, that God gave us this country. We are calling on everyone here to come and pray for this country. Liberia, God gave us this country.
Truly, God gave us this country. So let me read further. By the terms of the Ashburton Treaty, the United States bound themselves to keep a naval force of 80 guns on the west coast of Africa for the suppression of the slave trade. The first squadron sent to the station in 1843 was under the command of M.C. Perry, the Macedonian. Captain Mayo, the sloop, Commander Tatner, the sloop, Decatur 16, that's the quotation there where it came from. Commander Abbott and the brig Porpoise, Lieutenant Commanding Lewis, and when he was forced to return to the United States in consequence of ill health, was succeeded by Lieutenant Commander Craven. You were talking about M.C. Perry.
Yeah. So these guys, the reason that they are sent by the U.S. Navy, and the reason I'm listing these men here, is because they were sent on a mission of violence and war. They were not sent as like peaceful, what's the word I'm looking for? They weren't really being sent there as peacekeepers or people who were there trained in peaceful negotiation with indigenous sovereign Africans. They are there to destroy the defiance to European/American, Western laws that have been set up on the coast and imposed upon the indigenous people. However righteous the laws, the intention of the laws, I mean, I personally don't think the slave trade was a good thing. But from the perspective of the people who are enriching themselves off the slave trade, who are you to come and tell us that we can't sell our enemies? And you had, the European and American slavers, because there were American slave ships also plying the coast and illegally smuggling human beings into the United States. Because at this point in history, the U.S. still had, active chattel slavery in the southern states. So there was a demand for human chattel. So though the laws were there, they had the nerve in all these British colonies like Jamaica and Barbados and, the United States itself, all of these places still had chattel slavery. They still had chattel slavery, but they wanted to outlaw the importation of new Africans from Africa. It doesn't work that way. The demand is still there. So what ends up happening is they send these very violent, I'm just going to call them warriors. They're going there to go dispense violence, justice through violence, right? They're dispensing justice through violence, not through peaceful negotiation or treaties. And I'm emphasizing this because this is the kind of thing that marks the leadership of Roberts. And this is not to pass judgment. This is to just explain how things happen. This is what happens. Okay.
Call you said violence, dispense violence. What did that look like?
We will get into it in the next slide. So basically, if it meant, for example, Trade Town, which is in Bassa, that was a violent shutdown of the slave trade. They killed people in order to liberate those who were being kept hostage at the barracoons. They were being kept in these barracoons in order to release those people from those barracoons, those captive indigenous people of the Liberian territory. In order to free them from the barracoons, they had to violently fight their captors, those who were trying to sell them. So Trade Town basically was burned. Everything was destroyed. The captives who were liberated were then incorporated into the Commonwealth as part of the settlement, baptized and Christianized. And they had to basically beat the leaders of the area into submission. So after this violent conquest, then it's followed by a treaty. So violence first, treaty second. This is kind of the mantra, the approach of Mr. Roberts and his interaction with the people. He wanted to stop from doing what they had grown accustomed to doing.
Yeah. So let's keep reading.
Sorry, it's so wordy. I just wanted to.
No, it's good. We need the words.
Okay.
Right. So Commodore Perry was ordered to aid the colony in any and every way in his power, and also to inquire into and redress any act of violence committed by the natives against American vessels or persons. We took Governor, afterwards President Roberts, on board the flagship and touched at a good many points along the coast of Liberia where a show of force was necessary to bring the natives to terms.
So those are the words of Commodore Perry. So I want to back up a little bit.
Yeah.
So I highlighted Commodore Perry in the previous one because this was kind of, Roberts's, he took Joseph Jenkins Roberts along with him on these conquests. And the first thing I want to address is violence committed by the natives against American vessels or persons. And this was the excuse.
The crime.
This was the excuse used to justify the violence that ensued. Now, Liberian coastal people, the people on the coast of the Grain Coast, there is a long history of people along the coast, the Grebo, the Bassa, the Clow, all these people. There's a long history of them looting beached ships or ships that have run into trouble along the coast. Okay, and so there's times when the ships would be sinking or would be under duress. Maybe pirates had attacked the ship, maybe, whatever the case. And so they would go and loot the goods upon the ship. A lot of times these ships had human beings in the hull of the ship. They would release them. And they would steal whatever rum and other, if they had gunpowder, cannons, whatever they had, they would loot these things. So there's a long documented history of this happening. What I do not see is any evidence to support some of the things that they were saying about specific crimes against the American people or their vessels. So a vessel is found off the coast near the vicinity of an indigenous community. And it is just assumed that these people killed the ship, the captain and crew. This is an assumption that these people are the ones that brought the ship down, that it wasn't a shipwreck, but it was somehow men in canoes pirated and were able to subdue the ship. It just doesn't sound reasonable to me, given the context of the time period, that these indigenous groups would intentionally attack a vessel, unless the context where you see this happening throughout the history of West Africa is if someone has taken captives and the people from which the captives were taken, well, sometimes the king or the headman, they would sometimes take arms and try to retrieve their people, their citizens. And that is usually when you would see battles between people. So, for example, if somebody were to kidnap the children, the sons of a prominent person, those people could then go back and, raise an army and try to retrieve their people. But typically this didn't happen on the ship. It would happen at the actual barracoons on the beach where they're being held captive. They wouldn't actually go get in the water on a canoe and go follow ships that have cannons, because to tow cannon on canoe now it wasn't really a possibility. So the whole thing about, these people going and attacking U.S. vessels, it doesn't ring true to me. It doesn't seem like a reasonable accusation. But I wanted to clarify that this whole crimes, by natives against American vessels. But there was a understanding that you could, if a vessel wrecked within your territory, you had a free for all. You had a right to go and take the goods. So that was happening all over the world. If a ship wrecks on your shore, it's yours.
Right.
So that's a different thing. What we're talking about here is actual claims of attacking vessels. And then, so anyway, they took Governor Roberts at this time, he's not yet president. This is in 1843. So he's not yet president. I'm sorry, 1846. 1846. So he's not yet president. So they took him upon, on the flagship, and they were going along the coast. They're going along the coast, and they were snuffing out these barracoons. And does everyone understand what barracoons are? They're the places on the coast where they're holding slaves in captivity, awaiting slave ships to come so they can, sell the human captives that they have. And they were dotted all along the coast. And so their mission was, when they come along the coast, is to pull in and attack these barracoons and release the captives. Now, I want also to point out, when these captives would be released, they were released to the territory, not basically back into, they were released to the settlement, not basically back into the places they came from. Because some of these people came from great distances. They had been war captives from very far away. So they were always incorporated into the settlement.
Right.
Any other questions on this before I continue? Because this part is important. But, again, he says that this violence was necessary. And so the positive thing here is people who were on their way to being sold into slavery are now released, and they're given their liberty, and they're allowed to become part of the Liberian, at the time, Commonwealth. Right. And later on become the first citizens of the Republic.
The question is, at what cost?
The second part of this is people, these kings, slave trade was a violent thing. So they had very heavily armed guards. Because if you're selling human beings and you're not heavily armed and you don't have a military, the same buyers could come and just overpower you and just take you and the captives. Right. So to destroy a barracoon, you have to fight a military. You have to fight a battalion. And when, they're not going to just surrender. They fight to the death.
So this is their livelihood.
Yes. And also, we have to understand the culture of our people at the time. You were completely at the mercy of your king. So if you're supposed to fight to defend your people, you have no liberty to surrender unless the king says surrender. You're going to fight until you die.
Yeah. We effected the desired objective without having to resort to coercive measures, but Governor Roberts kindly consented to accompany the squadron beyond the boundary of the Commonwealth of Liberia to Maryland in Africa to assist in influencing the native kings to render justice and reparation where due to citizens of the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. So Roberts willingly went. He's basically, now we've got the Commodore claiming that Roberts went on his own accord, and it was to dispense justice to the citizens of the country, blah, blah, blah. So this particular area, they're going to what is now currently in Ivory Coast. At the time, it was part of the colony of Maryland. Right. So at the time, it was part of Maryland. I mean, the Republic of Maryland, because Maryland. The colony of Maryland. The colony of Maryland in Africa, which was, Harper. It went all the way into what is now Ivory Coast. The French took most of this territory. So this specific battle that occurred, was extremely disturbing. And this is why I'm highlighting it, because it marks kind of the mentality of the people against, basically, you're not a human being if you're engaged in the slave trade. You have no rights, to a trial. And it was already a world where you had human chattel rolling off the coast. And the mindset of the European male, when I say European, I'm talking about Europe and all of her descendants or children in places like the United States and elsewhere. The mentality was that African people, Negroes, as they called us at the time, whether we be native to Africa or if we were living amongst them, had no rights that they were bound to respect. The Negro has no rights that a white man is bound to respect, were the rules. And so you didn't have to have a fair trial and prove one's guilt to, violently retaliate. It would be justified because your rights were not recognized. You there, Dennis?
Yeah. Let's go to the next slide. And this is MC Perro talking. The king sent word that if we wanted anyone or any number of his tribe, we must come and take them. The next morning, we landed about 500 Marines and sailors, and still not desiring to burn the towns, a tent was pitched on the beach, and messengers dispatched to summon the king and his headmen to hold a palaver, as they term it. In about an hour, the king made his appearance, bringing with him some 10 or more sub-chiefs.
So they arrive, and the idea, what's happening here is there was a ship that had been wrecked offshore, and Commodore Perry accused the chief and said, listen, I need you to produce the people who pirated this ship, because it was just, a mile or two down the coast. We know it was your guys. Produce them, and we won't fight you. We don't want to burn down your villages, he says. The chief said, nobody here, pirated any ship. That ship washed ashore. We never pirated any ship. Those people were already dead when the ship washed on our shores. We don't know anything. Commodore Perry said he was lying. And so Commodore Perry sent word back and said, look, we know you have those guys, you're harboring them, produce these people. And the king insisted that the ship washed on the shore and the violence that occurred at sea had already transpired before the ship crashed onto their beaches. And, and that many of the goods that were on the ship that they were accusing them of holding were already looted when the ship arrived on shore. So it sounds to me, based on the king's testimony or the king's response, because it's not in court, is that someone pirated the ship at sea, which was very common, because this is a very violent period in history, killed everyone, looted the ship of its cargo and goods, and allowed the ship to drift. And the ship finally crashes at sea. It was an American slaver, by the way. It's an American slave ship that they're trying to defend and pretend that it was doing some legitimate trade on the west coast of Africa, which it was not. So they keep insisting that the king should produce the guilty parties. And the king says, you know what? You got to come for us then. So they're claiming that the king told them, oh, you want anybody, you got to come for them. I don't know if that's true. It could be true that the king said that. But I don't know why he would, on one hand, say that he did not do anything. They don't know anything, and then tell them, "Oh, y'all come for the people." If y'all, it just doesn't add up. On one hand, they're saying he was professing the innocence of himself and his people and his tribe, his clan, I should say. I'm sorry, not tribe, but his clan. And on the other hand, Commodore Perry claims that the king told them they should come and get the people themselves. Well, I don't believe him, but I have to put here what he said. I believe that Commodore Perry just decided he was just going to go and just, fight these people because that's what he was trained to do. He wasn't really trained to respect someone's adamant denial of guilt because he was an African. And so the king is the one who set up this palaver. He brought all of the council of elders and all of these people to try to negotiate with these people and say, look, we did not do this thing you're accusing us of doing.
So at this time,
I skipped this one. Skip this slide. That's a blur.
At this time, Robert was governor, I want to believe, not president yet.
Yeah, we're still on this, and the reason we are focused on this one is because he's still governor, but it set the tone for his presidency. And I'm focused on this particular one because all of the acquisitions he did during his first presidency occurred similarly.
So on the 5th of October.
Oh, I'm sorry. Before we read the slide, let me explain. So they went on shore. They captured the king. After the palaver, the king realized that the palaver was breaking down because when the king would speak and the translator would translate, Commodore would then, respond to the king. First of all, Commodore shouldn't be negotiating with the king. To show you how they did not respect this naval force that came in, did not respect these people. A Commodore should not be negotiating with the king in any sense of the word. I mean, this man could not go to Europe at the time and negotiate with Queen Victoria.
Right.
But he's negotiating with the king on his sovereign land as if, it's a military acquisition. And when the king was still during the palaver professing his innocence, Roberts is present. At no time does Joseph Jenkins Roberts say, you know what, we in the Maryland, because Maryland is separate from Liberia at this time. Maybe we should call in some of the Marylanders. Not one time did they call in any of the colony of Maryland, the people from the Maryland settlement to come in to help them. Not at any time did they recognize that they were in the territory of Maryland and that these kings were sovereign within the protection of Maryland. At no time did they acknowledge this. At no time did Robert say, I'm outside of my jurisdiction here. We in Maryland territory. So he never did this, stood there with these people and witnessed the Commodore Perry execute a sovereign monarch on his own soil. In fact, they shot him. They killed his army that was protecting him. Many of the headmen and chiefs that tried to flee were killed on the spot. Many of them. And Commodore Perry doesn't even care to say, maybe we shouldn't have killed these people. I mean, when he writes of it, he's boasting. Joseph Jenkins Roberts is present. The king himself, who was the head of the headmen, right? They take him because he's bleeding, he's almost mortally wounded. They in fact thought he was dead at one point, he wasn't, and so they took him on board the ship, claimed to have been wanting to render aid. He later died on the vessel. They wrapped him up and threw his corpse overboard. Commodore Perry writes about this. Not even having the decency to give him a burial. This is a monarch, a sovereign monarch. So it was for me, it was a very difficult read. I have been familiar with it for quite some time, but going back and looking at things that kind of marked for me Robert's early career as a political head of Liberia, first as the head of the Commonwealth. This is 1 year before he became president that this is going on. I just had, to include this because he was present, and it never occurred to him to object to anything that was happening, nor did it occur to him to seek the counsel of the people of Maryland, say, hey, this is happening in your territory. Do you believe that this king is innocent of what he's saying? Negotiations could have occurred. The Marylanders would have probably said, no, this man is not a violent king, just like all the other headmen that came in council had been saying. It didn't matter. It didn't matter. Someone had to pay. They had to send a message to all the other people on the coast that you do not interfere with a U.S. flag vessel. When likely it was a European pirate ship that interfered.
Yeah.
So now we're going to go on to Roberts, the president. So that's the backstory. This is right before he becomes president. And he became president uncontested. They say he was elected, he was uncontested. So this is also extremely important for us to note.
Right. This we still have our election in October, so that's a good thing. On the 5th of October, the first election took place under the new constitution when Joseph Jenkins Robert was proclaimed president of the Republic for 4 years. So it was uncontested, but we still call it election, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's democracy.
So he became president, and one of the things is, he was the darling boy of the American Colonization Society. As you can see, the Commodores, everybody loved him. Roberts, was very popular among the Americans, and so part of the negotiation for independence, I believe, was for them to keep someone in power who because it was like you have your head, not even your hand, but your whole head in the lion's mouth.
Yeah.
And you have to pull this head out without violence. So the founding fathers of Liberia, we talked about this, the whole founding fathers of Liberia were trying to establish independence. They didn't have the ability to do so violently. So they had to negotiate with wit. All of the land, the territory that had been acquired in the Commonwealth of Liberia belonged really to the American Colonization Society, not to the immigrants of Liberia. They were all on, being given ACS land. So this myth that people have, oh, my grandfather had deed, that's not true. Your grandfather didn't have a deed. ACS the land was negotiated by the American Colonization Society. There was not a single Black person in 1821 that went to Cape Mesurata to negotiate for land with King Peter. And we've established that in previous episodes. So ACS, It was acquired for the purpose of ACS. So now you're looking for independence. One of the requirements ACS had told these people is, you have to make sure our property rights are protected. And the brilliant response of the founders, the drafters of the Constitution was, that is not our mandate. Our mandate is to draft the Constitution. It is not to address property rights. Once we've established a republic and we've ratified our Constitution, then we can address ACS property rights. So one of the things that they did in that Constitution was they made sure that you couldn't own land if you were not a Liberian. You couldn't be Liberian if you were not a Black person. And that is how they were able to, literally outwit the ACS and be able to take the land from them through a very peaceful, nonviolent process, because they underestimated the intelligence of these people. Roberts becoming president was a way to appease. It was like a give and take. All right, we'll keep your boy Roberts in charge.
You're right.
We'll keep your boy Roberts in charge.
Right. So it's important you mentioned that we till today we call that non-Negro clause, right? That in order to be a citizen of this country, you should be of Negro descent.
Right.
And that's the only way you are qualified to own property. If not, the ACS will own a lot of land, right?
They were going to own everything that was sold at that point. In fact, the Commonwealth of Maryland, it was owned by the Maryland Colonization Society until they declared their independence. And even after they declared their independence, it was still owned by the Maryland Colonization Society until it became incorporated by Liberia and now had to be under Liberia's constitution. So so it wasn't so much the Negro Clause. What they added, the Negro Clause was agreed upon by everyone. Yeah, you're a black country. Oh, only you guys can be citizens, no problem. But the what they slipped into the Constitution, that only citizens can own land.
Yeah.
And indigenous people cannot sell their land to anyone. So citizens can own land. The indigenous people who have land, they can't sell their land to white people either. They have to keep their land within their tribes and within their kingdoms. They also, within the territory of Liberia, must keep their land. They cannot sell it to Europeans. I mean, brilliant foresight that was written into the 1847 Constitution. That was really how we were able to protect land sovereignty, not only for the settlement on the coast, but for the indigenous people in the interior parts of Liberia.
So Roberts spent the first year of his presidency attempting to attain recognition from the United States, where it was opposed mainly by Southern congressmen as well as several European nations with neighboring colonies.
Yes. So initially, in 1847, although when, the first independence was declared, there was this gun salute. The Commodores brought all their ships off the coast, the American and British Commodores, and they had a 21 gun salute, and it was all festive. But they really, they were just doing it on their own. This was not recognition by their parent countries. These are just, because Roberts was working closely with the U.S. and British Navy, so they recognized it in the sense of they celebrated it. But what didn't happen was formal recognition of Liberia, and therefore formal trade with Liberia wasn't being recognized. Excuse me, 1 second. I gotta fix something before I go off. Let's see.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, this is the Liberia History Channel on Focus on Liberia. My name is Dennis Jai, and we are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. In tonight's edition, what we're talking about is our first and seventh president, that's Joseph Jenkins Roberts. We are on the whole series discussing the presidents of Liberia. Joseph Jenkins Roberts. He became president twice. First in 1847, that's his first presidency, and then he also became the seventh president. What set his tune was, according to Call now, that he was very close to the ACS, the American Colonization Society. In fact, she calls him their boy. So he became the first president uncontested. And now we have Joseph Jenkins Roberts. America, even though ACS came from America, did not recognize Liberia independence. And Joseph Jenkins Roberts' first year, he was trying to get that recognition.
Right.
Back to you.
Right. So he's struggling for this, and the reason he's struggling for this is because trade. If you are not recognized as a country, your ports are not sovereign. You can't control your ports. You can't levy taxes. You can't control who's coming and going. And there was already, at the very inception of the country, an economic embargo against this little struggle. They were treating Liberia the way they treated Haiti, even though Liberia was not a violent revolution for freedom. They didn't. The reason they even Liberia obtained its independence as carefully as they did, as tactfully as they did, is because they didn't want to be treated the way Haiti was being treated. Haiti had a global economic embargo. No one would trade with Haiti. Haiti became isolated, and Liberia was becoming the same way. The ships stopped coming to the ports, and even if they did, they wouldn't recognize the government of Liberia's presence as they did the ACS. They didn't have any problem, even though the settlement, the Commonwealth of Liberia, wasn't actually a country. They didn't have any problem paying taxes to a Commonwealth, but now it's an actual republic. But because it is a Black republic without a parent, a corporate parent, body, it now becomes, if we start negotiating with these people, it's not going to look good for us, for what we're doing, further down the coast. So the French didn't really like it. The British finally decided to agree to recognize Liberia, and then later on, many others followed.
Good. In 1846, Joseph Jenkins Roberts, traveled to Europe to meet Queen Victoria and other heads of state. The UK was the first country to recognize Liberia as an independent country.
Yeah. So in 1848, he went to go see Queen Victoria, and that's why Great Britain, that's the real reason Great Britain, he had to get on a ship and go to see the Queen, and they granted him audience. And he explained to the Queen, that he wanted to be recognized and that he would give Britain preference with trade and all kinds of things he had to say to prevent the colony from being economically starved. And so there's also pressure from the indigenous populations because they're also suffering from this economic embargo. So the indigenous traders too are like, wait a minute, you guys, you're controlling the ports along the coast, and we're not being able to negotiate the way we were before. And in fact, they're basically coming and they just take goods without much support. I mean, without much in return. They're not paying us fair, value for our goods. So he was getting pressure. So when he went to the Queen agreed to recognize, Queen Victoria agreed to recognize Liberia.
And that recognition, why was that necessary? If somebody may ask, you want to trade, you want to do stuff with this country. So why was it important that America, the Great Britain, recognized Liberia?
If you don't recognize the country, they can't levy taxes against you at the port. You don't have to recognize their laws. You don't have to trade with them fairly and equal. It just becomes no man's land. But when it's a republic, you have to adhere to global treaties and how you interact with them. So now, remember we said, European mindset was Black people or African people and people of African descent have no rights that a European is bound to respect or. So if you observe and recognize Liberia, you are now bound to recognize the rights of the human beings in Liberia.
Right. And who are these people that we be on the same footing?
Yes.
Kind of mindset. So in 1854, Maryland colony declared its independence from the Maryland State Colonization Society, but did not become part of the Republic of Liberia. It held the land along the coast between the Grand Sass and San Pedro rivers until 1856. It requested military aid from Liberia in a war with the Grebo and Kru peoples.
Yes. So you have on the one hand, British, American, and now French harassing and being very violent against the indigenous clans along the coast, the southeast coast, going all the way into what is now Ivory Coast. And we talked a bit about what occurred, the violence that occurred against one particular settlement. So now they have incited the Clow and the Glebo people to fight Maryland because they're pushing on one end and they're inciting these people. They're saying, hey, we're not really the problem. We're not the reason that you guys can't trade. It's those abolitionists that have come. It's the Marylanders that are doing this. When the Maryland Colonization Society was there, the British and the Americans were very much present to protect the colony under the Maryland Colonization Society. When the African immigrants and the Grebo neighbors decided to become a country, they no longer were protected. So there is also, again, another economic embargo where they're going to starve them, through unfair trade practices. So now they have to go to the mercy of the Republic of Liberia and say, hey, if we don't do something, the French are going to take over this entire territory and we are going to be part of under French control. So they appeal to President Roberts, who then negotiates with the U.S. Navy, knowing that they were really the ones arming the Grebo crew, right? against Maryland. So now they go in and there's this intervention, and then there becomes a violent interaction between the U.S. and the Grable and crew. I mean, when I say the U.S., I mean the U.S. Navy, the Liberian forces with the U.S. Navy, and then on the other hand, you have the French supporting the Grable and crew with weapons because they want that territory.
And that is important call to mention that, because there's a lot in history about the Grable and crew wars. So not to deviate, but let's talk a little bit about that. You say the entire Grable and crew wars, or Grable and crew people at one end fighting, they were fighting the Maryland Colonization Society, or the
Republic. Maryland was a country at this point. They had declared their independence. They were a separate country from Liberia.
And you were saying,
and nobody recognized them, so they were being economic. There was an economic embargo, and the same way they didn't want to recognize Liberia, but Maryland didn't have the resources to go travel to Europe to beg Queen Victoria for recognition.
So now you're saying the French in the Ivory Coast, because this San Pedro area today is Ivory Coast. So you're saying the French were kind of engineering this, pumping them up to fight Maryland as a country.
Yes, because they wanted San Pedro, they wanted, all of these people, these places.
Go, if you can adjust your audio as we take a short break.
Okay.
So you can adjust that audio.
At Focus on Liberia, we discuss everything Liberia, from education to politics, arts and culture, entertainment, agriculture, history, religion, family, and technology. Focus on Liberia uncovers and showcases the best of Liberia and shows the world the truth about Liberia. We educate, elevate, and promote all things Liberia. We conduct interviews, panel discussions, debates, and more. Tune in to Focus on Liberia on Facebook and YouTube and be a part of the stories that make up the news.
This is Focus on Liberia, and I am Dennis Jah.
So yeah, you were talking about the incentive of the French to kind of, as we said.
Yeah, I mean, even the battle that we described earlier, where the U.S. went in. The U.S. Navy went in. Commodore Perry went in with this violence. That happened at Grand Beverly in which is now in Ivory Coast. At that time, that was all Maryland. All the way to the San Pedro River was Maryland. So the French wanted this place. So they start to incite these people. And the people at Grand Beverly, they already hated Americans anyway because of the violence of Commodore Perry that had happened very recently. So they were able to arm these people and tell them that, and by the way, it was not the Maryland Colonization Society. They had absolutely nothing to do with that violence that occurred in their territory. Again, Commodore Perry never even made reference to them. They took Roberts all the way from Liberia, which was a separate country from Maryland at the time, and took him with them to dispense violent justice against the people of Grand Beverly. So they were already disgruntled. It wasn't difficult to give them arms and say, hey, your problem is these uppity, westernized Africans that returned from slavery. They're your problem.
Right.
So they didn't raise up against Liberia. They rose up against Maryland, because at this point, the British, the French are recognizing Liberia as a country, but they are not recognizing Maryland. And Marylanders, in their hard-headed defiance, didn't care, not that they didn't care they weren't recognized, but pursued their right to self-determination anyway. And many of the Grables living in the vicinity of the settlement were on the side of the settlement because they had been going to school with the people, they were going to church with the people. And unlike the Republic, unlike the Liberian colony, the Commonwealth, Maryland was more integrated.
Mm.
So the coastal Grable people had already been somewhat westernized anyway. So there was a lot more integration and cultural, mingling between the populations in Maryland. And so when these people were incited against Liberia, it wasn't all the Grable and all the Ku clans. It was mostly those who are today in Ivory Coast. Mostly. I didn't say completely.
Okay.
And
Question for you. You're talking about Perry.
Mhm.
Riverside Closer, is it the same Perry guy named after Perry Street in Monrovia?
No,
Probably.
no.
This was way before.
Well, it's not just that. I don't believe that they named any streets, except with the exception of Ashman. Perry, I believe was I have to look that up, but I remember reading about so Perry was not, I don't believe it was named after Commodore Perry. It's a different Perry.
Could be. The latter were resisting the Maryland colonists' effort to control their trade in slaves and other goods. Roberts assisted the Maryland colony, and a joint military campaign by the two groups of African American colonists resulted in victory. In 1857, the year after Roberts left office for the first time, the Republic of Maryland joined Liberia as Maryland County.
Yes.
After Robert left. So now Robert is out of office. After his first presidency, Robert served for 15 years as a major general in the Liberian army, as well as a diplomatic representative of the nation to France and Great Britain. In 1862, he co-founded Liberia College in Monrovia, where he served as its first president until 1876.
Yes.
You understand why Liberians love Joseph Jenkins Roberts?
Well, of course, every country loves its first president, right? People love George Washington. Every country speaks of its founding fathers and its first leaders with respect and reverence because of what they did for the country. The purpose, of these series is to talk about some of the things that you don't hear about in elementary school. Subject matter that is not really, this is the people's history of Liberia. So Roberts being part of this whole Commodore Perry, mentoring this guy, he becomes the major general of the Liberian army. And he's going around Cape Mount. During this period, he goes to Galenas. You had this most notorious, horrible Pedro Blanco was a slave trader that was based in Galenas, which was acquired by Roberts during his presidency, violently. So Galenas was run by Pedro Blanco and the Vai Kingdom jointly. So you had the Vai kings feeding Pedro Blanco human cattle that they were capturing. And even if you go, there's so many famous stories. The Amistad captives were brought through Pedro Blanco's Galenas. If you're familiar with the Amistad story. So this was one of the last major slave, this wasn't even just a barracoon. They had a whole fort built there at Galenas, at the mouth of the Galenas River. So when Robertson went in, they flattened the place. Right now, if you go to Sierra Leone, I've been on the site, they still have the ruins of the slave castle. They bulldozed it with cannons, but there's still remnants of the walls and the buildings that were there. So they had an actual dungeon, and Pedro Blanco was running this place. It was Roberts who put an end to it and planted the Liberian flag, and claimed that whole area as Liberia. It was later, we'll talk about in the future, how it was taken away from Liberia and now is in Sierra Leone. But it was Joseph Jenkins Roberts that rescued and ended that illicit trade in that place. He led that acquisition. It was extremely violent, but he's the one responsible for snuffing out the slave trade in that part of West Africa. And again, destroying Pedro Blanco's operation and planting the Liberian flag. Another thing that he would do when he would acquire these territories along the coast through violent acquisition, he would forbid the indigenous people from allowing Europeans to settle on the coast for the purpose of trading in human beings. There were many Europeans permanently housed all along the coast, controlling slave trades, like Pedro Blanco, who was there and had women and children and all kinds of horrible things he was doing, pretending to be almost like a king of Galinas. So when he got rid of Pedro Blanco, who left alive and went on to go, live the rest of his life very rich in Cuba, but at least he was no longer instigating wars against people north of the Galinas River, the Kisi populations, the Bandi populations up there, Mendi. All these people were no longer going to be subject to raids and slave wars. So this was one of the
So Robert did while he was president or while he was major in the army?
Both. So it started while he was president, and then to maintain the control. So even though he was removed by his vice president, and I kind of glanced over that, but maybe I should touch it a little bit. The reason Roberts was not elected again, and his vice president is because of his violence. Right. If you go back, it was like, come on, you gotta calm down small. This obsessive almost need to have absolute order and control over everything all the time. When you read accounts of Liberia during Robert's presidency, the Sabbath Sunday was observed. It was almost like everyone was living in a tightly controlled camp. Yet they said only 1/3 of the population actually belonged to a church after independence because they gave religious freedom. So all of the indigenous people living within the vicinity could now be part of Liberia. They didn't have to go to church. Roberts didn't like that. Sunday, everything had to shut down. I mean, it was regimen. People wrote about it. People traveling to visit Liberia. Oh, these people are so organized. I mean, in America, you don't see anyone drinking in Liberia on Sunday. You don't see anybody disorderly. He had rigid control over the population. So when he was removed, his own vice president ran against him and won.
Right. So there was an election, and his vice president ran in that election
against
and won.
Him and won.
That's Stephen Allen Benson.
Yes, who we'll talk about next week.
And this is important too that we state that, because this is a sharp contrast to what we see now. So a president, the vice president run against the current president. The vice president wins. The current president will go on to serve 15 years as a general in the army.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it today. And he also went on to start the what we know today as the University of Liberia and became its first president.
Yes.
This is profound. It
is. He was adamant that Roberts was adamant that they needed a better crop of Liberians. The reason only 1/3 of the population had belonged to a church is because after independence, they insisted on the Constitution declared religious freedom. They couldn't force people to go to church anymore. So you had all of these recaptured Africans. You had all these indigenous people that had been incorporated, though baptized and given Christian names. Sometimes they would say, I don't want to follow this. I don't want to do it. I've got my shrine over here. And so it became a problem. And Roberts thought the problem was they weren't educated. And one of the things he did, besides negotiating for recognition, is he was going all around trying to get in the Caribbean. He went to Barbados. He's the reason you have people from Barbados that immigrated to Liberia. Roberts was going all around trying to get a higher crop of immigrants, meaning he was sick and tired, and he voiced his frustration with the repatriated Africans from Congo Basin and what is now Nigeria and Benin, from Niger Delta area. We had all of these recaptured Africans from slave ships that were released and liberated in Liberia. You had all of the people that are coming from the barracoons along the coast of Liberia that had been liberated from slavery, from potentially being sold into slavery. They were in Liberia. So all of these people were sort of kept, you know, in the colony, and he thought it was bringing down the quality of life because they were not culturally similar to himself and the people that he felt that, you know, way Liberia should be. He felt if they had greater numbers of westernized Africans, it would bring up the mindset of the other people in the colony, and they would be forced to comply and conduct themselves like the westernized Africans, like himself. And so he went to Barbados, even went to Jamaica, you know, hey, Liberia is there, you come, we're gonna give you land, you can come in. And he built a university also because he thought if they were educated at a higher level, that they would comply with this Western culture and mindset. He was very, very adamant about that.
Oh. So fast forward, we have his second presidency.
Yes.
So he went, served in the army, he did the president of the university. Now he's back. So in 1871, President Edward James Roy was deposed, and Roberts won the ensuing presidential elections and returned to office in 1872.
Yes.
He served for 2 terms until 1876. While Roberts was incapacitated by illness from 1875 until early 1876, Vice President Anthony W. Gardner served as acting president. So after Roberts, we have Stephen Allen Benson, we have Daniel B. Warner, and now Roy.
Mm-hmm.
So Roy now is disposed, and Robert is coming back. He came back and he became president.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so we have, when we talked about E.J. Roy in depth, we talked about Robert's opposition to Roy. Robert's mindset was, we have to be as European-like as possible. We have to comply and conform to these powerful people as much as possible, and it's essential for our survival. We have to prove to them that we are just like them in order for us to survive as a country. We have to speak like them, we have to think like them, we have to act like them, we have to pray like them. That's the only way they're going to allow us to survive. They have to see us as they see themselves, as much as possible. And you have African people saying, no, we don't. We can be who we are. We don't have to be brown Europeans. We can be Africans, and they must respect us. So True Whig Party, while it was a color thing, and Roberts was very much an elitist, and it was in fact somewhat of a color thing because you had populations coming in, a lot of mulattoes, like the Uri clan. All these people were being released into Liberia. They were given much more privilege because they were somewhat, you know, in West, they were a little bit more westernized. These either if they had been what we call house slaves in the United States, or freed blacks from the northern states, even if they were dark skinned, versus plantation people, like the people who were in the Mississippi Colonization Society, plantation hands who were more like the recaptured Africans than they were like Roberts. Right? They were more like the recaptured Africans. So a lot of these people who were released to places like Mississippi, they did not have that Western culture. They were, what in Robert's mind, they were less refined in Robert's mind. This is his way of looking at the world, and thought that these people needed to have the influence of a higher grade of immigrants. So this is why he was trying to draw people from Barbados and all these places to come to kind of bring up the cultural morale and of the society. I'm trying to say that as tactfully as possible. It's a horrible way to think of human beings, but this was what it was. This is what it was in the 1800s. It is still like that to this day. A lot of people think this way. A lot of people still think this way to this day. So there's really, I shouldn't keep apologizing for the past, because there are people right now, that think that, Black people should relax their hair and Black women shouldn't have their hair. Black people who would never, want to look anything that would make Europeans uncomfortable. They're still happening. There's still Africans who, because I've got dreadlocks in my hair, this is a problem. Why you can't relax your hair or bleach your skin small, to try to fit in with the people. You were born on that side. Why you got to be looking so African all the time? There's that mentality still exists. And, it's an unfortunate thing, I think, with all of the advances that have been made in human rights and in everything, that people still think this way. But at this point in history, it was not only an ideology. To Roberts, it was just the truth. It was just a fact that people should conduct themselves. And this was, instead of them looking at it as being Western culture, they considered it civilization.
Right.
So there was no such thing as African civilization. It was just Western culture was civilization. Everything else was barbarism.
Right. And also from what I'm hearing, Robert was like, hey, we can't fight these people. We need to conform.
Right. Because we won't survive. And if you come in here with your radical ideas of an African, Pan-African state where all the natives, everybody can live happily, and you're going to have the Mohammedans, what they used to call Muslims at the time, and the pagans, everybody's going to be living in this African state, and we're going to really live out this constitution. They're going to starve us economically, or they'll just forcibly acquire our territory. So for the sake of our sovereignty, we have to conform and pander to these powers, because we don't have the ability to assert ourselves and remain free, because it is a threat. It is a threat to our existence. If they see us standing up for ourselves and asserting our rights as human beings, just like themselves, we now become a threat to them. That's how so unfortunate the world was structured and still is structured to this day.
Right. And looking backwards, almost 200 years, it's very easy to say, oh, what was he thinking?
People still think this way, right?
Right. But if you go back in 1871, that thinking was not far-fetched.
People still argue this today. We were on a platform on this show on Tough Talking Thursday, and a very intelligent man, said, we can't divorce ourselves from America. I mean, he's looking at it like it's a marriage, right? Like it's some obligatory situation. Like it's not a matter of, give and take in the best interest of the state. It is, you can't do it. You cannot, even if it's an abusive, one-sided relationship, you still must be under the thumb of America. And this is in 2022. Intelligent, well-educated Liberians speaking this way. So he would have gotten along with Roberts great if he pushed him back in 1872. He would have been a part of the Liberian Republican Party, not the True Whig Party. So the True Whigs were radicals at this time in history.
Right. And you see that same, if you look at, as we always, we read Garvey, Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, those kind of mentality or this kind of disagreement existed.
Yeah.
Hey, let's do it this way. If you go to Ivory Coast and you read about Houphouët Boigny, we're saying, well, we know what France is doing to us is bad. We know we are not getting our fair share, but what can we need to survive? We want them help us build our country. This is what we need to do. So when people like Laurent Gbagbo, he said, Gbagbo, you're a young man. I like your energy, but we have to survive. Let's take it easy with them. So, and you
this is a man who basically pretended to harbor his son-in-law and literally led him into an ambush, according to the secretary, accused him of leading, leading his son-in-law Talbert into an ambush after the president was assassinated. So this is a man who had done many dirty things out of cowardice against Africa, committed horrible crimes against African people out of the cowardice, that cowardly thinking that if you don't subdue yourself or subject yourself to the humiliation of pandering to these people. You will die. So that fear leads them now to commit atrocities against themselves in order to survive, which makes absolutely no sense. See, fear is not rational. People think fear is self-preservation, but a lot of times it's not. Because in human beings, fear is not rational. You can be afraid and it can cause you to do something terrible to yourself. And building the biggest church in Africa does not absolve you of crimes you committed against African people.
And Carl, till this day, and I know we've been asked this question or this topic, this issue always come up like, hey, why weren't we colonized? I mean, we could have been like Ivory Coast, and we have streets, and we have the basilica, and we have this, and we have that. You know, so this kind of the mindset or the way we think about it, and it was still on the same, I think, Tough Talking Thursday when I said this whole concept of international community. And somebody said, Dennis, there's nothing you can do about it. We are not an island. We are not isolated people. So we should always, kind of look up to this imaginary international community. I call them imaginary because I don't think of any community. People are just their own countries and they look at their own interests.
Every relationships between countries are relationships of interest. Nobody does anything for you because they feel sorry for you. They do it if it's in their best interest to do it. If it's not in their best interest, they will let you die. They'll let you kill yourself. So even give you more weapons so you can continue. So it is what it is. We have to recognize that, as Dr. John Henry Clark says, we have no friends.
As a colonial governor, Roberts appeared before a large and respectable audience at the Tabernacle, New York, where he made some interesting statements respecting an exploring tour he had made in the interior of region outside of the territory. That's the
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's an old slide.
Yeah, that's an old slide, but it's important, kind of when he was governor, he made it. So Roberts died.
He was a great lobbyer for the country. Roberts, I mean, the only president we've had that lobbied for Liberia internationally to the level that Roberts did was Tubman. I mean, I don't know, maybe because Tubman served longer, but both of them served for a very long time. If you compile Roberts' entire time, even when he was with the military, he was still lobbying, which you'll see when his vice president, Stephen Allen Benson, becomes president next week. Roberts was still conducting himself as if he was head of state. So when he was a military general, he was still conducting himself as though he were head of state. So Roberts really was in power from the days of the Commonwealth until he died in 1876. So it's really he was a dictator in a lot of ways. I mean, Tubman, being a true Whig Party guy, is the only person that lobbied to the extent that Roberts did, of all the presidents. And Roberts not only lobbied for recognition of sovereignty, I mean, he was going around making friends for the Republic, looking for people to emigrate who were better skilled in his mind, more educated, more civilized in his mind. And he was going all over the world doing so, working with church groups and trying to convince African-American missionaries to come to Liberia and teach and work in the Liberian college and do all of these wonderful things. And so he was extremely successful in doing so. And, he conducted himself like Liberia was his baby. Like it was his country. And he felt that it should comply and conform with his vision. And so he wasn't very diplomatic and didn't really appreciate having to negotiate with other members of the people in the country who were powerful. He felt that, they should just listen to him.
Yeah.
Very dictatorial.
And that's why it's very hard to start something, right? Because if you start something, you don't know how far it's going to go. So you have a vision, right? And by starting something, I don't mean to say that Robert started Liberia, but he was the first president. So the tune that he sets is going to, go with the country for a long time, if not forever. So, and he couldn't operate outside what he knew.
Mhm.
So Roberts died on February 24, 1876, less than 2 months after his final term as president ended. He was buried in Pine Grove Cemetery in Monrovia, that's Center Street.
Yes.
Joseph Jenkins Roberts.
Yeah. Roberts, whose grave has been desecrated numerous times. Used, yeah.
So if we look at Robert now, today, what would you say his presidency, what is Robert remembered for? We're going to go take comments and then open the phone lines. But let's talk about his legacy. What did Robert leave behind?
So a lot of property, which he donated to the church. Being the first president, a lot of the property that was acquired by the ACS went on, he inherited. He basically died and left his property to the church. So he's remembered for acquiring more territory for Liberia. Liberia without Maryland, was about 500 coastal miles without Maryland. I want you to think about that. So we lost a lot of territory to Sierra Leone and coastal territory to Sierra Leone. He acquired land going far into past the Plantain Islands, almost to Freetown, really. And unfortunately, the British later took those things after his death. But Roberts was, I think that's one of the greatest things to be remembered for, is, making sure Liberia was recognized as a country. And because it was recognized, it still exists. And that initial recognition required people. He understood that if they did not recognize Liberia's sovereignty legally and officially, they would constantly be at risk of losing the country. So he made sure that meeting with Queen Victoria solidified our sovereignty. People will say, oh, he was an Uncle Tom. Oh, he was this. Yes, he probably was. But it was his Uncle Tomming and his, bootlicking, as people like to call it, that got him and got a country recognized that still exists. The reason Maryland was being taken away from Maryland is because they did not have recognition. They had no laws that anyone was bound to respect. Liberia did. So they had the only place that could go and solve Maryland's problems was Liberia. They say, you know what? We want to be part of Liberia because Liberia already had that recognition. And once that happened, the encroachment had to stop. So the war, where the Crew-Grable Wars, where it ended, is where the boundary was drawn. And the Crew and Grable people that were fighting Maryland, probably thinking that they were going to remain sovereign, then got swallowed by France and subjugated by France, which is very unfortunate.
And that's how we have our Grable brothers now across the Kavala.
Yeah. And not even owning their own land across the Kavala. They got to come to Liberia to hunt. They got to come to Liberia to farm, because the land on the other side belongs to these big merchant, industrial French European farmers. So they can't even do the things that they can do in Liberia, where they're technically not citizens of.
Always this thing come up, and as we'll bring comments, a lot of people in Liberia remember Roberts also has been light-skinned, and because of that, he had this thing against dark-skinned people, and that was the crush of the disagreement between Roberts and E.J. Roy. If you spoke about Roberts kind of siding with the ACS and also because he wanted the country to survive. So it's like, let's take it easy with these people. Could that play a role, or could that also be misinterpreted as he was, he favored light skin over black skin or darker skin?
Yeah, Roberts was a prolific writer. He wrote a lot, and so he never once articulated that. However, the reality of that time, the reality of this time, is colorism. And so a lot of times, people, when you're lighter skinned, people consider there's a mindset that if your skin is lighter, you are better, you're closer to white. And this is the legacy of white supremacy. I mean, they teach us that God is white, right? They show you Christ, and Christ is a white man. And so the closer you are to this white man, the closer you are to God. And
Right.
so this happened among the free, this happened among enslaved, and Europeans themselves
Right.
created this
Jacob was white and Esau was darker, and that's why
they
God
created
favored.
a whole what do you call it? Christianity created this whole mythology around it. You know, that the sons of Shem and all kinds of stuff that doesn't even really make any biblical sense, but they created it in the minds of African people. They were condemned that their black skin was a curse, even though science shows that that's really what you're supposed to look like, and that if you're not black, you're actually a mutant. That's what science shows. It's a mutation. Lighter skin is a genetic mutation. It's a deviation from the original. And unfortunately, you know, the mindset of people. So even today, you've got women with, you know, beautiful dark skin bleaching themselves to look less like themselves. And they're doing it voluntarily. Nobody's forcing them to do it, because everyone has bought into the theory of white supremacy, even people who are not white. I mean, it's a global phenomenon. It is very unfortunate. So yes, it existed at that time. People would, you know, if it was an indigenous girl and she was mulatto, you know, because a lot of the people on the coast would have children with foreigners, that indigenous child would be married, you know, could easily get married to a rich and powerful immigrant than a fully African indigenous child. So the so-called mulatto indigenous kids or women, young girls, were likely to get married to these rich, powerful, you know, American-Liberians because of the way they looked. Even though they're culturally, they were raised Kru or they were raised Bassa, it didn't matter, you know, because they looked more European. So this mindset had just been accepted, you know, that's how you're supposed to, you know. So it's very, very true that there was colorism in Liberia in the 1800s. There's colorism in Liberia in 2022. There's a lot of people who say that certain people would not have risen to prominence had they not looked the way they look. You know, we follow people on social media because they're red. You know, it's just absurd, the mindset that we have. And that's something that needs to be addressed on another show.
Yeah.
But besides that, the real conflict, the colorism is present, it's constant, it still exists today. But the real conflict was ideological, because not even all the light-skinned immigrants believed that they needed to subject themselves to this.
Yeah. Let's get a few comments here. We already answered this one. Was Joseph Jenkins Roberts a founding fighter? Founding fighter meaning you were part of the Declaration of Independence. He wasn't.
Yeah, he wasn't on the Constitution Committee, yes.
Right. And River says he didn't know you were a daughter of family.
I'm a married woman. I'm a married woman. I'm not Vi. I'm married to a black man.
and River says if people call and family together, you are crossing two different counties. So she's married into a family. I
am a mom woman.
Yeah. Bagame. River says it's happy that it's in class today. FSA, thanks Miss Call for your continuous commitment to bringing us Liberian history. Sam is just joining, but he can afford to miss the class. River says, under Joseph Jenkins Robert, Liberia gained recognition from the United States and several European countries as a sovereign nation.
including
Why were
Haiti.
they still carrying on slave trading in a country they recognized as sovereign? Was he weak or reluctant? River says, who was carrying on the slave trading, you say? I didn't get that part.
I don't know what he's talking about either.
Okay. African diaspora, say hello, Dennis. Hello, African diaspora. That looked like Davisha Johnson.
Mhm.
Welcome. Ever say, yes, he brought these people to Maryland. Rawa is equally responsible for the death of the king and his men. There are some comments here that don't make sense. Somebody say we're not even going to read them. Alice Johnson. So, says Carl, thanks for sharing the vast knowledge on our history. Are you working on any project to write books on Liberia's history based on your research? It is important to start writing our own history from our perspectives. In-depth knowledge about our history is kept outside Liberia, especially in the US. Most of the things you share with us, we didn't learn them in school. There is a great need to write books and put them in our libraries in Liberia. Thank you. Aliyu Samba Kamara said, great history lesson today. I hope we stay on this trajectory.
Yes.
You know where he's going, right?
Let me call it. I like talking to Aliyu.
Evers say, I'm enjoying this edition, a well-balanced narrative.
So Elvis, it's always well balanced. I always say things as they happen. I don't know where you get the mindset that I don't, but every episode is balanced, and every episode tells things as they happened. Right. And the only reason sometimes you think it's balanced is if it supports what you already have in your head, and that's unfortunate because there are some things whenever I'm trying to learn something new, I try to suspend my disbelief, take the information, and then sort through it afterwards. And then River Says Pro had asked a question, and I think I understand what he might have been asking. He said, they were so countries were not carrying on slavery. Illegal people were doing slave trade. So the slave trade was abolished in 1819. Americans and other Europeans were still engaged in the slave trade. It's not the country, it's the citizens of the country doing illegal things.
Yeah.
So if the United States, was still the last slave ship that came to the United States was a U.S. slaver, American slave ship. This was an American bringing slaves to the United States in 1864. So, this is not the same as the United States Congress selling slaves.
Right.
So we have to understand that citizens of countries do things that are illegal. So the slave trade after 1819, which continued until the 1880s, it was completely illegal. And that's why you had this whole military presence. And that's why Roberts and all these people were fighting these barracoons and shutting them down. And really, it wasn't until slavery was abolished that in the West that the trade across the Atlantic stopped. Because you can't keep having people in captivity in slavery and then expect people to stop bringing the slaves in. So it really didn't end officially until slavery was abolished in Brazil and Cuba and these last, places where it was finally abolished.
Thank you. River says, even today, the light skin mentality still exists at job sites.
Yeah.
Emmanuel Logan, one of the best historicity ever on the show. I highly appreciate the call. Keep coming, you hear more. Joseph Kokoro, JJ Roberts gave us a country. Unfortunately, he never thought what he wouldn't know what to do with it. Oliver Zudo said, what happens to the kingdom now? How come we don't see it existence now? Which kingdom? Scott said, Carl, did you read Dr. Richard Hall's book on Afrique shows? Just wondering. All right, those are a few of your comments here. If you want to join the show, you can call this number 605-313-6004. The code is 791-403#. We have less than 20 minutes to close, so you can be a part by calling the number that is on your screen. Okay, there's a reverse search pro concern. It is just about it is not, I think it believes when you said building the biggest church is not authorized. It is not about the biggest church. The French provided security during times when it was needed in the Ivory Coast, something the Americans could not do. Despite Omega, Firestone, other institutions they had in our country. In other words, he said the French protected Ivory Coast and America couldn't protect us.
Protect the Ivory Coast from what, themselves?
From
Who they protecting Ivory Coast from? That is bizarre, a bizarre statement. How your conquerors will protect you?
So anytime there's war, if one group rises up against another, then America should come and say, no, stop fighting. Let me put you on my back and feel your battle.
My nephew must have fallen down. I hear them over there taking care of him. Amen.
All right. We're going to take a short break while we wait for our callers here to call. And we always want to remind ourselves our country, Liberia. Take a listen.
Our country, sweet country, Liberia. Our country, that God gave us this country. Little Liberia, that God gave us this country. We are calling on everyone here to come and pray for this country, Liberia. Liberia, God gave us this country.
Right. Whatever your belief is in a supreme being, when the song say God gave us this country, you can believe, but it is our country is given to us. It was created for us, right? We are one people. So don't think about it as a religious thing, right? It comes from God. Meaning, we took over this country. It was given to us. Someone signed the Declaration of Independence, or someone created it.
Yeah.
And now we have it. So this is our country. Let's do our best. And we always want to stress that. Still on Joseph Jenkins Roberts. Carl, let's wrap this up. We don't have callers here.
That's fine. Yeah, so I mean, this is part 2. So we covered this extensively last week. And I think that it's important for us to understand that this country that we all call Liberia is our home, and that people fought for it and fought to defend the country and sought to defend ourselves. Ethnicity, it's fluid. I say this a lot, and Roberts understood this. The reason I say so is he understood that he thought that being Liberian was being westernized in his mind and his vision, that he felt that not only could he because remember, Robert's time, there were no countries other than, Ethiopia and Liberia. Roberts felt that he could westernize a group of highly educated, skilled Africans coming to Liberia, could spread their wings and help westernize, in his mind, civilize the rest of the continent.
Hold that thought, Carl. Let me bring in one caller here. And not to go into the politics of it, we want to see, that presidency, what is different now as we go through. But let me get our first caller here. Caller, your name and where you calling from.
This is Abraham, a.k.a. Rochester. How you doing?
Mr. Abraham Victor.
Yeah.
Go ahead, you're live, sir.
What's up? Okay, Yeah, thank you, Cisco. A lot of this information you're giving, honestly, we learned about Joseph J. Robert in school, but it was just a brush over. You go into a lot of details that I've never heard. You go into, his life history, his family, his wife, and all those things. That's very, very important. That's very critical. Hopefully, you're working on a book like that guy said, so we can learn these things. All we learned, Joseph J. Robert was the first president, gave recognition from other people. But this is great. Thank you very much for what you do. Yeah, my little point, what I was saying about the Ivory Coast too was, earlier we were talking about that mentality of caving into the French people. I just thought maybe back then people needed security guarantee. Even right now, there are reasons people ally themselves to America. Other people ally themselves to Russia. Africa is split between Russia, China, and other people. I think it comes to economic benefits, it comes to security, it comes to a lot of things. So that was my point of saying, at least the Ivory Coast still standing where during the war, the entire country could have been obliterated as, like Liberia, the whole system broke down thanks to the French. Mm-hmm. But I want to get something clear on the Maryland thing, Cisco. So I don't know if I got it right. So what's the Ivorian? Yeah, I hope I got it right. I know Maryland was trying to declare independence from independence from Liberia.
No, not
that it was the French. It was the Ivorian that encouraged them to try to break up from Liberia, and Joseph J. Robert helped in that process to get them annexed back to Liberia, where the Ivorian mostly instrumental in trying to get Maryland away from Liberia. That's my question.
There was no
Thank you. And River says, before you go, people always say, write a book. When called write a book, will you buy it?
No, absolutely. I will buy it.
Hold on, River says, hold on. Right here, I got a book. Do you have a copy of the Republic of Liberia Foundational Words of Our Nation?
Exactly.
Check it out. Check it out.
Have a copy. Huh?
Check it out on on Amazon. But thank you.
Okay, yeah, I would. Yeah, me and Cisco friends on Facebook. You can send it to me in my inbox, and I will check it out to see if I can get a copy. A lot of history. That was my subject in school: history, literature.
All right. Thank you. Because people always encourage others to buy to write books.
To write, they don't want to buy it,
and nobody's reading them. I went to sell when my brother and I co-authored a fiction called The Notebook of a Warrior. We went to sell it, and the guy couldn't buy it, but right in front of us, he bought 2 roasted fish.
That is funny. I don't know why it's funny, but it's funny.
Yes, we encourage librarians to buy more Liberian books. So let's go to Riverside's story. It's a question call.
So there was no such thing as an Ivorian until the 11th of July, 1960. So this is more than 100 years before there was such a thing as an Ivorian. So at this period in history, there was a region called the Ivory Coast because that's where they used to go and buy ivory. There was a region called the Grain Coast. There was a region called, so there was no country called Ivory Coast. There's no such thing as an Ivorian at this time in history. There were French trading, French trying to gain control. The Berlin Conference had not yet occurred. That occurred after Joseph Jenkins Roberts' death. So there were no colonies in the sense of a country politically exerting itself. There was French economic interest in the area. So the idea that at this time in history, Ivorians, and Maryland was never a part of Liberia. They became a part of Liberia, but before that, they were never. It was always a separate colony. There were many colonies that were completely separate from each other along the coast. When they decided to become a Commonwealth in 1835, under the American Colonization Society, Mississippi Colonization Society, all these places joined. Maryland remained by itself. So Maryland didn't get its independence from Liberia. It got its independence from the Maryland Colonization Society. And when they broke away from the Maryland Colonization Society and called themselves a republic, no one recognized their sovereignty. And as far as the French protecting Ivorians, they did not protect Ivorians. They destroyed their kingdoms. They looted all their resources. They literally enslaved the inhabitants. They had forced labor. People died in mass erecting their cities, Abidjan and all of their coastal towns. People died in mass building their roads and infrastructure, and they were doing so not at their own free will, but by force. So there was no protection coming from the French. Colonialism was not protection. Colonialism was brutal exploitation. It was death. It was torture. It was destruction.
Thank you. Let me take one more caller before we close here. And that's Oliver. Oliver, you're live. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. How you doing? This is Oliver from New York City. Cold. I'm always one of the same in the corner. Thank you for having me. Yeah, my question I asked, if you can correct me if I'm wrong. I was referring to Swakoko, Kinsaboso, and what you call it, Kuma. So I don't know whether they were kingdoms, but then where they are right now and where are they? So are they still carrying on that leadership of kingdoms?
Okay, we just want to kind of maybe limit it to Joseph Jenkins, Robert, but thank you. We got your point now.
Thank you so much.
All right, thanks. All right, that will be all for our callers today. We have 5 more minutes to close.
Yeah.
Call. Let's conclude.
So Roberts is a very fascinating person. He had beliefs that are still held to this day. And I believe that if Roberts had not been the first president of Liberia, in lieu of the circumstances and the way the world was structured and the mindset of the enemies of African people at the time, if Roberts had not been who he was, I do not believe Liberia would have been recognized. It would have been short-lived, and it would have probably been colonized or divided between France and the UK. After the Berlin Conference, which the United States was weak and not part of, the U.S. didn't have a seat at the table, so the U.S. doesn't have a colony because at the time they had just come from civil war and they did not have the resources that the European countries did. So without Roberts and his what people call his pandering to the Europeans and Westerners, if he had not been, for lack of a better term, an Uncle Tom, it is very probable, that Liberia would have been divided between those two European powers of France and the UK, and would not exist today. And some of us would be Guinean, some of us would be Sierra Leonean, some of us would be Ivorian.
Yeah. So you'll be Guinean, I'll be Ivorian.
Yes. My husband would be Sierra Leonean. Yes.
Thank you so much. Next week, we're going to go into the second president, that's Stephen Allen Benson.
Yes. So look forward to that. He is one of my favorite presidents. Didn't serve for very long, but he's a very interesting person. And so please tune in for Stephen Allen Benson, one of my favorite individuals, one of my favorite people in Liberian history, not just one of my favorite presidents.
Thank you so much. We want to thank you, Carl, for always coming to present Liberian history. This is the History Channel. Please follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and all social media platforms. We at Focus on Liberia educate, elevate, and promote all things Liberia. We want to thank our viewers for following and always following the show. Please continue to follow the show and ask questions. Your suggestions, your ideas are always welcome. Drop me a line, focusonliberia@gmail.com, or you inbox us on Focus on Liberia. Until then, we're going to close with our song that says, we are all Liberians. Have a good night and God bless you.
We are Liberians.